You are naked. It is 160,000 years ago, somewhere on what will one day be called the Atlantic coast of Africa. The temperature has dropped 20 degrees in a week. Wind moves off the ocean and across a landscape of grass and rock. You are standing at the entrance to a cave and you have nothing on your skin. Not a stitch, not a scrap of hide, nothing. This is not a metaphor. This is your actual situation. Your species has been hairless, properly, fully hairless, for nearly 2 million years. Every other creature alive tonight either has fur or is warm enough without it, or has moved somewhere warmer. You have none of those options. You are cold, and you have been cold before, and at some point in the next 100,000 years, your species is going to do something about it. The question is, what took so long? And more importantly, what finally pushed you to act? Here's what most people miss. Clothing is not just a human invention. It is a human paradox. Every other animal that lives in cold climates either evolved thick fur across millions of years, migrated toward warmth, or eventually died out. Your ancestors did none of those things. They lost their fur first, deliberately in evolutionary terms, and then walked into progressively colder environments anyway, and then had to solve the problem they had created for themselves. Nakedness was the design, clothing was the workaround, and here's what makes it stranger. Clothing didn't arrive the way we tend to imagine inventions arriving. There was no moment of inspiration, no single ancestor who looked at a dead animal and thought, I could wear that. What happened was slower and stranger, and far more interesting. It was a chain of small decisions, each one building on the last, stretched across tens of thousands of years until the practice of covering the body was as natural as using fire or carrying water. By the time humans had sewn a proper fitted garment, with a needle, with thread, with actual technique, they had already been improvising for at least 120,000 years, possibly far longer. Pelts, scrapers, awls, needles, each generation inheriting what the last one had figured out, until one day they were dressed, and they never looked back. 2 million years ago, your direct ancestors were covered in fur. Not thick fur like a bear, but a dense coat of body hair covering the torso, arms, legs, enough to provide real insulation in the cool of night and shade from the equatorial sun. Then, over hundreds of thousands of years, they lost almost all of it. This was not a disaster. It was a trade. Early Homo erectus was abandoning the forests and spreading out across the open savannas of Africa. The terrain changed everything. In the forest, you could find shade. In the open grassland, there was nowhere to go. The sun at noon was brutal and relentless, and your ancestors had begun doing something that no other predator on Earth had ever done at scale. They ran. Not sprinting, running, for hours. In the middle of the day, when the heat was worst and every other carnivore had retreated to shade and stillness. They practiced what biologists today call persistence hunting, tracking prey for kilometers until the animal, unable to pant fast enough, collapsed from heat exhaustion. A kudu can outrun a human over 50 meters. Over 5 kilometers under a midday sun, the human wins. But to do that, you have to be able to shed heat faster than you generate it. And fur holds heat, so natural selection went to work. Over hundreds of thousands of years, body hair thinned and then nearly disappeared. Sweat glands multiplied to take its place. Humans today carry somewhere between 2 and 5 million eccrine sweat glands across the surface of the body. More than almost any other mammal alive. Each one is a small cooling engine, drawing heat out of the blood and releasing it through evaporation at the skin's surface. When you run a few kilometers and feel the sweat start, you are running a system that your ancestors evolved 2 million years ago to hunt in a landscape that would have killed any other predator that tried to follow. The price was nakedness. Permanent, total, full-body nakedness. It worked perfectly in the heat of the African savanna. It was a triumph. And then the climate began to shift. Cold periods came and went with increasing severity, and the thing that had made your species extraordinary in the heat became a liability. You were fast and clever and cooperative. You were also completely without insulation. That was the problem. The solution was going to take a while. The oldest direct evidence for clothing production doesn't come from a frozen northern site. It comes from the Atlantic coast of Morocco, from a cave called Contrabandiers. In 2021, paleoanthropologist Emily Hallett from Arizona State University and her colleague Curtis Marian published a landmark study in the journal iScience. They had been analyzing more than 12,000 bone fragments recovered from the cave during years of excavation. Buried in that mass of material, Hallett found a workshop. 62 animal bones had been deliberately shaped into tools, awls for piercing hide, spatulas for smoothing and softening leather. The evidence of use was unmistakable. Polish marks worn into the edges by the same repeated motion across thousands of work sessions. The geometry of hands that knew exactly what they were doing. These tools dated to between 90,000 and 120,000 years ago. But there was more. On the bones of carnivores recovered from the same layers, Hallett identified cut marks. Not the marks left by butchering an animal for meat, those appear across muscle attachments, at the joints, deep into bone where the flesh is thickest. These marks appeared at the periphery, at the edges of paws and legs and extremities. The precise pattern of skinning an animal for its pelt while leaving the meat largely untouched. The people of Contrabandier's cave were hunting carnivores specifically for their fur. They were removing those pelts with care, using purpose-built bone tools to process the hides, and they were doing this continuously over a span of at least 30,000 years. That is not improvisation. That is a dedicated, inherited, generationally transmitted industry. And it predates the invention of agriculture by 80,000 years. Think about the scale of that practice. 30,000 years of the same craft, passed from parent to child to grandchild, in the same caves along the same coastline. The people who learned hideworking at Contrabandiers would never know that anyone before them had done it too. They would never know that anyone after them would continue. It was simply how things were done. The knowledge was so embedded it had become invisible. Here is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting, because Homo sapiens was not the only human species wearing clothes. At the Krapina site in Croatia, researchers found 8 white-tailed eagle talons dating to approximately 130,000 years ago. The talons bore cut marks and showed a specific pattern of wear, polished facets consistent with being wrapped in fiber or rubbed against each other repeatedly over a long time. The conclusion, published in PLOS 1 in 2015 by Davorka Radovcic and her colleagues, was that these talons were strung together as jewelry. Neanderthals were wearing eagle claws around their necks, but that was the decoration. The clothing was more practical. Across multiple European sites, researchers have found cut marks on carnivore bones, bears, hyenas, lynx, wolves, that follow the same pattern as the marks at Contrabandiers. Marks concentrated at the paws and extremities, not at the meat-bearing parts of the carcass. In 2023, archaeologists in Germany announced they had found cut marks on cave bear paw bones from a site dating to approximately 300,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens as a species even existed. The occupants of that site were likely Homo heidelbergensis, the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. This tells us something important. Clothing did not originate with your species. It originated with the broader lineage of humans. The whole family of Homo, long before the split that produced Neanderthals and Homo sapiens separately. Both branches inherited the practice. Both refined it. When modern humans eventually encountered Neanderthals in Europe, somewhere between 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, both were already dressed. The question was not whether to wear something. The question was how well you could make it. Here's the problem with ancient clothing. It rots. Stone tools survive 3 million years in the ground under the right conditions. Bone can last nearly as long. But leather, hide, plant fiber, sinew, these materials vanish in centuries, sometimes in decades under most burial conditions. The gap between what ancient humans made and what we can actually find is enormous. Contrabandiers gives us tools and cut marks. It doesn't give us the garments themselves. Nothing does. Not a single piece of clothing has survived from more than a few thousand years ago, and even those are rare beyond reckoning. Which is why in 2011, a team led by David Reed, Associate Curator of Mammals at the Florida Museum of Natural History, tried a completely different approach. They didn't look for clothing. They looked for what lives in clothing, specifically lice. Human body lice are genetically distinct from head lice. They diverged into a separate population when their host, that would be you, started wearing clothes. Body lice live in fabric and fiber. They lay their eggs in the seams of garments pressed against warm skin. They cannot complete their life cycle in hair alone. There was no body louse before there was clothing to live in. By sequencing the DNA of both louse populations and calculating the rate at which the two lineages diverged genetically, Reed's team could estimate when the split occurred. The answer was 170,000 years ago, give or take. That is 50,000 years before the bone tools at Contrabandier's cave. 50,000 years of wearing something before we have a single piece of direct physical evidence for it. And that date, 170,000 years ago, aligns almost exactly with one of the most severe cold events recorded in the last 500,000 years. A sharp, sudden drop in temperatures across Africa. A period when food was scarce, populations were small, and survival demanded every available adaptation. The first clothing was not an experiment. It was a response to a crisis. Something to wear in a moment when having nothing was no longer an option. For tens of thousands of years, clothing was draped. You took a pelt, wrapped it around your body, held it in place with a strip of sinew, or pressed it under your arm. It kept you warm in still air. In wind and heavy cold, it was less effective. The draped fur shifted. Gaps opened. Heat escaped. It worked. But it had limits. The needle removed those limits. A sewn garment is a different thing entirely from a draped skin. It sits close to the body. It traps air. It stays in place when you move. It can be shaped for arms and legs and the specific geometry of a human torso. The difference between a draped hide and a sewn garment is, roughly speaking, the difference between sheltering under a tree and building a house. The oldest confirmed sewing needle in the world was found in Denisova Cave, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. It is carved from the bone of an unidentified bird. It measures just under 3 inches long. At one end, a hole has been drilled with extraordinary precision, fine enough to thread sinew or plant fiber through. Discovered during excavations led by Mikhail Shunkov of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Novosibirsk, it dates to approximately 50,000 years ago. It is still usable today. If you threaded it and handed it to a tailor, they could work with it. Here's the part that should stop you. This needle was almost certainly not made by Homo sapiens. Denisova Cave was home to a separate, extinct human species, the Denisovans, first identified from fragmentary DNA found in the same cave and only described by science in 2010. The evidence points to Denisovans as the likely makers of this needle. Another species of human, one we only discovered 15 years ago, may have invented sewn fitted clothing before we did. The technology to shape a garment to a body, to join two pieces of hide with a seam that holds. That may not be a Homo sapiens innovation at all. We may have learned it, or inherited it, or independently discovered it. We don't know. But the Denisovans were sewing while your direct ancestors were still probably draping. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans began moving north out of Africa in substantial numbers. They crossed into the Levant, pushed into Europe, spread across Central Asia, and eventually reached Siberia. The environments they entered were unlike anything their species had evolved for. Ice sheets covered vast stretches of the northern hemisphere. Winters in what is now France and Germany lasted 5, 6, 7 months. Temperatures in Central Europe during the peak of the last glaciation could drop below -20 for weeks at a time. Human skin cannot survive that unprotected. Not for one night. They survived it for thousands of years. Clothing made that possible. But the key insight from David Reed's lice study is that the humans who crossed into Europe were not improvising. They had been making and improving clothing for more than 100,000 years by that point. The techniques for identifying which animals had the best pelts, for removing those pelts cleanly, for scraping and softening the hide, for cutting and shaping it, all of that knowledge was already ancient when they crossed into the cold. The needle had been invented. Sewn seams were possible, and the people making the crossing had accumulated generations of practical wisdom about how to keep a human body alive in conditions it was never biologically designed to withstand. It is tempting to think of the migration into cold climates as an act of desperation or survival under pressure. And there is truth in that. But it was also something else. It was the expression of an accumulated competence, thousands of years of craft, refined in the warmth of African coastlines, and then deployed successfully against the worst cold the world had to offer. They weren't adapting to the ice when they arrived. They had been preparing for it unknowingly for the entirety of their existence as a species. Today you buy a coat without thinking about it. You find it on a screen, you pick a color, you click, it arrives in 2 days. You try it on in your hallway. It fits or it doesn't. If it doesn't fit, you package it back up and send it somewhere, and a new one comes. The whole transaction, from wanting warmth to having it, takes less than a week and requires no physical skill whatsoever. Your ancestors spent days preparing a single pelt. They tracked an animal. They killed it. They skinned it with a stone blade, working slowly and carefully to keep the hide intact. A small tear at the wrong moment, and you had to start again with a different animal. They scraped the inside of the skin with a bone tool, removing fat and connective tissue in long, deliberate strokes, feeling the resistance change as the hide became thinner and more uniform. They stretched it on a frame and weighted it at the edges and let it dry. Then they worked it again, folding and pressing and rubbing until the stiffness left and it became something you could put against your skin without pain. And then they shaped it, cut it, pierced the edges with an awl they had carved themselves, threaded sinew through each hole with a needle made from the hollow bone of a bird. Every person who wore clothes 50,000 years ago understood in precise physical detail exactly how those clothes came to exist. They had made them, or they had watched someone make them, and helped, and learned each stage. The knowledge of how to survive, how to convert a dead animal into warmth, lived in the hands of every adult in the group. It was as basic and as bodily as knowing how to walk. We traded that knowledge for convenience. We traded intimacy with the material world for speed. In 10 generations, a blink in the 170,000-year history of clothing, the entire chain collapsed. We outsourced it. And the knowledge that once kept people alive in -20 winters now lives only in the hands of a small number of specialists. In factories most of us will never see, producing things we will never fully understand. The warmth is identical. The separation is total. Somewhere on the Moroccan coast, 120,000 years ago, someone scraped a bone into a tool and pressed it through the edge of an animal skin. They did not think of themselves as innovators. They did not know they were participating in something that would eventually enable their descendants to survive ice sheets and colonize a planet. They were cold and they were skilled, and the solution was in their hands. The needle came later. The fitted garment came later still. But the impulse, the specific human impulse to look at the raw material of the world and ask what you can make it into, that is the oldest thing about us. Older than language, older than art, possibly older than the species itself. The next time you pull on a coat without thinking, take 1 second to think about it, about the chain of hands that had to figure this out before yours, about the 170,000 years of practice compressed into the simple act of staying warm. You are wearing a very old idea. You just forgot where it came from. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and join us for more ancient history videos explained through simple visuals and brought to life one story at a time.